So Charles Spencer walks into a room full of royals, wearing a Savile Row tuxedo and carrying a folded piece of blue paper that nobody approved. And within about 15 minutes, the entire carefully constructed narrative around Queen Camilla just collapsed on live television. And the thing is, the palace handed him the podium. They literally invited him to speak, wrote a speech for him, loaded it into the teleprompters, and assumed he would just read it because that's what aristocrats do at galas. They smile, they make polite remarks about legacy and unity, and they go home. But Charles Spencer is not just any aristocrat. He's the brother who stood in Westminster Abbey and delivered that eulogy. He's the one who refused to let the palace control how Diana's sons mourned their mother. And apparently he's also the one who spent 6 months working with lawyers to create a legal structure so airtight that not even the king could touch it. So when he stepped up to that podium at the Victoria and Albert Museum, he wasn't there to surrender anything, he was there to detonate something. And before we get into exactly how this all fell apart, real quick, if you enjoy breaking down royal drama and the moments where the palace loses control of the narrative, hit subscribe to our channel. We're following every thread of this story. Okay, so let's talk about what actually happened inside that gala, because the contradictions start piling up before Charles even walks through the door. That morning, the palace press office had leaked a briefing to the Times saying the Spencer family was about to hand over Diana's final artifacts to the Crown Trust. They framed it as healing, they framed it as unity, and they did it deliberately knowing that if the public expected a surrender, Charles would look like the aggressor if he refused. It's a classic palace PR move. Set the expectation, force compliance through public pressure, and make anyone who resists look petty and difficult. They assumed Charles would fold. They assumed wrong. What they didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except for 2 people, is that Charles and Prince William had been working on something completely different. And the timeline here matters because it shows this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment emotional decision. 6 months of legal work, 6 months of absolute secrecy, the kind of secrecy where you can't tell your staff, you can't tell your friends, and you definitely can't let anything leak to the palace machine. Charles had a lead barrister working on creating what's called a sovereign trust, which is basically a legal entity that exists outside the reach of the crown. The British monarch has a lot of power, but sovereign immunity doesn't apply to private trust structure correctly. And Diana's divorce settlement from 1996 had an obscure clause buried in it that her lawyers quietly inserted while the palace was focused on stripping her HRH title. That clause said her private intellectual property, her diaries, her letters, her personal papers, would forever remain the property of a private citizen. The palace didn't think it mattered at the time. They were so focused on removing her royal status that they overlooked the one thing that would come back to haunt them 3 decades later. You have to appreciate the legal genius of what Diana's team did back in 1996. They were negotiating against the full weight of the crown's legal apparatus, an institution that had spent centuries perfecting the art of absorbing private assets into royal control. And while the palace lawyers were obsessing over titles and precedents, and whether Diana would still be called Her Royal Highness, her own legal team slipped in a clause that seemed utterly trivial at the time. It was buried in paragraph 17, subsection 4 of the financial settlement. Nobody flagged it because it didn't involve money or property in the traditional sense. It was about intellectual property, about personal papers, about the intangible things that don't show up on a balance sheet. The palace lawyers read it, shrugged, and moved on to arguing about the divorce payout. They had no idea that 28 years later that forgotten clause would become the legal foundation for dismantling their entire narrative control operation. And Charles Spencer knew about that clause because Diana had told him about it. She had sat with him at Althorpe one summer afternoon and explained exactly what her lawyers had done and why. She said the palace would try to rewrite her story after she was gone. She said they would wait until enough time had passed, until the public grief had softened into nostalgia, and then they would move in and claim everything. She made Charles promise that he would never let that happen. And Charles Spencer is a man who keeps his promises. So now we're at the gala. Queen Camilla is sitting at the head table wearing the Greville emeralds, which is a choice. Those emeralds have history. They belonged to Queen Mary, then to the Queen Mother, and now they're on Camilla. She's positioned as the matriarch, the woman who outlasted the scandal, the woman who finally secured the crown. Her PR team has spent years softening her image, painting her as the quiet, misunderstood partner of the king. And this gala is supposed to be the culmination of that, the final step in absorbing Diana's legacy into the palace's controlled historical narrative. The white lilies everywhere, Diana's favorite flower, used as decoration at the event where her memory was supposed to be boxed up and archived. It's almost too on the nose. But Camilla is confident. She's sitting there with the French ambassador making small talk about healing and unity. And she waves off her equerry's concerns about Charles arriving. She thinks his tension is nerves. She thinks he's struggling with the humiliation of public surrender. She has no idea what's about to happen. The atmosphere in that room before Charles entered was almost celebratory. The palace had orchestrated every detail. The lighting was warm and flattering. The champagne was vintage Krug. The seating chart had been arranged to project an image of harmonious continuity with Camilla at the center, surrounded by loyal courtiers and carefully selected members of the aristocracy who could be counted on to applaud at the right moment. The cameras were positioned to capture her best angles. The teleprompters were loaded and tested. It was a stage production designed to broadcast one message to the world. The drama of the past is over. The crown has prevailed and we are all one happy family now. But stage productions depend on everyone following the script. And Charles Spencer had brought his own script. One that had been quietly written and legally fortified over 6 months of late-night meetings and encrypted phone calls and documents signed in solicitors' offices far from the prying eyes of the royal household. The palace had spent half a year planning a coronation of their narrative. Charles and William had spent that same half year planning an insurrection. Meanwhile, Prince William is sitting 2 tables away in his guard of honor night evening dress, projecting absolute composure. And this is where it gets really interesting, because William's stillness wasn't stoicism. It was focus. He had a black encrypted phone in his pocket, which is a massive security violation at a royal event. Royal protection officers are hyper-vigilant about unauthorized devices, but William is the Prince of Wales. He has emergency override codes for the Royal Broadcasting Network, a fail-safe designed for national crises. Nobody questions the heir to the throne accessing systems he technically has authority over. And what William did with that authority is the kind of move that takes years of patience to execute. He didn't just scramble a teleprompter, he commandeered the entire broadcast feed. When Charles Spencer walked to that podium, the palace-approved speech was glowing on the glass screens. The first line read, "I am profoundly honored to permanently transfer the Spencer Historical Trust to the Crown." Charles looked at those words, and then William tapped his phone twice and the screens went black. The control room beneath the museum went into complete panic. Error codes everywhere. They tried to cut the live feed to the 3 million people watching at home, but they couldn't. William had activated a code alpha override, a protocol meant for national security emergencies. The only way to stop that broadcast would have been to physically cut the power cables to the museum, and nobody was going to do that in the middle of a televised royal gala. The chaos in that control room was absolute. Technicians were shouting over each other, frantically typing commands that did nothing, pulling up diagnostic screens that showed a complete system lockdown. The director was screaming into his headset for someone to kill the master power switch. But the master power switch was in a locked room 2 floors below, and the override protocol had changed the access codes. The broadcast engineers who had spent weeks preparing for this event, who had run countless rehearsals and checked every contingency, suddenly found themselves locked out of their own equipment. One of them later described it as watching a ghost take control of the ship. And while they were panicking, Charles Spencer was unfolding his blue paper and preparing to speak. The 3 million people watching at home had no idea they were witnessing a technological coup in real time. They just saw a man step up to a podium with no teleprompter and no notes except a single folded document, and they sensed that that was about to happen that the palace had not planned. So, Charles is standing at the podium with no teleprompter, no approved speech, and a room full of 500 aristocrats and dignitaries waiting for him to speak. And he doesn't panic, he doesn't hesitate. He reaches into his tuxedo jacket and pulls out that pale blue paper with a High Court of Chancery seal on it. And you have to understand what that seal represents. The High Court of Chancery deals with trusts, estates, and equitable claims. It's not criminal court, it's the court that handles property and legacy. A document bearing that seal means something has been legally structured and approved at the highest level. When Camilla saw that seal, she knew. Her face went pale before Charles even started reading, because she recognized that whatever was on that paper had already been through the courts. It was already done. There was no stopping it. Charles started speaking, and his tone wasn't angry. It was worse than angry. It was calm, melancholic, almost nostalgic. He talked about how history gets curated by those who survived, how grief gets softened and tidied up over time, how Diana didn't live a tidy life and didn't want her truth edited by the institution that tried to silence her. He spoke about his sister not as a princess or a public figure, but as a woman who wrote her thoughts in private journals late at night, who documented her pain and her joy and her fears in her own handwriting, who deserved to have her own voice preserved exactly as she left it. He talked about the promises he made to her, promises that had weighed on him for nearly 3 decades, promises that he was finally in a position to keep. And then he read the declaration, the entirety of Diana's personal archives, her handwritten diaries, her private correspondence. All of it was being transferred into a new trust. Not the Crown Trust, not the Royal Historical Trust, a completely separate entity called the 1997 Heritage Trust. And the executors of that trust weren't palace courtiers, they were her 2 sons, William and Harry. And they had authorized the immediate unredacted global publication of her final journals. The room shattered. Camilla physically recoiled, knocking over her water goblet, ice water spreading across the white damask tablecloth like a stain, and nobody moved to help her. No equerry rushed forward with a napkin. The aristocratic crowd, people who were trained from birth in rigid etiquette, completely abandoned decorum. Dukes stood up from their chairs, duchesses gasped out loud, the press corps surged past their barricades, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, and through all of it, William sat perfectly still and slowly pushed back his chair and began walking toward Camilla's table. His protection officers were shouting at him to stop. Arthur, the equerry, tried to intercept him. William said 3 words, "Stand down, Arthur," and kept walking. The equerry froze. That's the authority of the future king, not the current king, not the queen consort, but the heir who will one day sit on the throne. And Arthur's training overrode his panic. He stepped aside. William reached the head table and leaned down, placing both hands flat on the wet tablecloth, bringing his face close to Camilla's. She whispered his name, her voice stripped of all royal authority. She asked what he had done, and William said he did exactly what the palace told him to do. He secured the history of his family. Then he picked up the black encrypted phone, tapped the screen, and showed her what was on it. An automated delivery confirmation from the BBC, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. The entire Spencer archives decrypted and ready for publication. The global embargo was lifting in 60 seconds. Now, let's talk about what was actually in those diaries, because the reaction of the journalists in the room tells you everything. A veteran royal correspondent, a woman who has covered palace scandals for 30 years, opened the file on her tablet and dropped the device to the marble floor. She fell to her knees. She sobbed. This is not a woman who cries over palace drama. This is a hardened journalist who has seen everything. And what she read on that first page was a diary entry from August 1997, written just weeks before Diana died. And in that entry, Diana wrote that the men in gray suits, the palace courtiers, had finalized a blueprint. She wrote that they couldn't erase her while she was alive, so they would sanitize her after she was gone. They would orchestrate a grand public unification of her charities. They would force her family to surrender her history to the royal trust, and Camilla would wear the crown's emeralds, smiling at the cameras, using Diana's stolen legacy to wash the blood from her hands. Diana wrote that in 1997. She predicted the exact scenario that was playing out in that room. The gala, the trust, the emeralds, the cameras, all of it. And Camilla was sitting there wearing those emeralds while a journalist read Diana's words aloud to a room full of 500 people and 3 million viewers at home. The illusion that the palace had spent millions of pounds constructing. The image of Camilla as the quiet, dignified consort who had earned her place through patience and devotion just evaporated. Diana had called it decades in advance with specific details, and now the whole world was reading it. But it gets worse for the palace, because while this is happening, the secure emergency line at the head table starts ringing. It's the red phone reserved for direct communication from the sovereign. King Charles III was watching a broadcast from Buckingham Palace, and he was calling into the room. Arthur the equerry reached for the phone with trembling hands, but William moved faster. He grabbed the receiver, walked back to the podium, and pressed the earpiece against the live microphone, so the entire room and the entire broadcast audience could hear what his father had to say. And the king's voice came through the speakers stripped of its measured public tone, raw and panicked. He ordered William to cut the feed immediately before he destroyed everything. And this is the moment where 30 years of suppressed grief and rage just came pouring out. William stood at that podium, the same stage where his uncle had just detonated the first bomb, and he spoke directly to his father on live television. He reminded him of Balmoral in 1997, the freezing morning when a 15-year-old boy was told to button his dark suit, swallow his tears, and walk behind his mother's coffin for the good of the crown. It reminded him of 3 decades of standing silently beside the woman who broke his mother's heart, of being the dutiful shield, the good obedient heir, protecting an institution that had demanded everything from him and given nothing back. He talked about the nights he spent as a teenager at Eton, lying awake in his dormitory room, hearing the other boys whisper about his mother's death, about the conspiracy theories and the tabloid headlines, and having to wake up the next morning and pretend that none of it affected him because that was what princes did. They endured. They stayed silent. They put the crown first. And then he said the words that ended the conversation. The crown does not own her soul, and you will not own her history. The embargo is lifted. The world will read her words unedited and unchained. And he pressed the red button and disconnected the call on the King of England. While 3 million people listened, the silence that followed lasted maybe 1 second, and then the room erupted. Not in panic this time, but in applause. A thunderous ovation that broke centuries of royal protocol. Dukes and ambassadors and charity workers and journalists, people who were supposed to maintain composure, stood and cheered. And in the center of it all, Queen Camilla sat ruined, weeping silently, the Greville emerald still heavy around her neck, in the shadow of a legacy she could never defeat. So, when you actually look at what was said versus what happened, the palace's version of events doesn't hold up at all. They told the Times that morning that the Spencers were surrendering the archives. Charles Spencer got up and read a legal declaration proving the archives had already been moved into a sovereign trust beyond the crown's reach. They said this gala was about unity and healing. Diana's own diary from 1997 described the exact scenario as a blueprint for erasing her memory. They said Camilla was the dignified queen consort who had earned her place, And she sat there with a spilled water goblet and a face drained of color while her stepson publicly dismantled her husband's authority on live television. That's not a narrative that can be spun. That's not a PR crisis that can be managed with a carefully worded statement. The palace can't walk this back because the documents are already published. The embargo lifted, the world has Diana's words, and the trust is legally sovereign, meaning no one, not the king, not the palace lawyers, not the government, can seal those archives or restrict access to them. Charles Spencer and Prince William didn't just win a public relations battle. They changed the legal reality permanently. The palace spent 30 years trying to control Diana's legacy, and in one night, on their own stage, at their own gala, with their own cameras rolling, they lost control of it forever. The ghost they tried to box up and file away just burned down the archive.